It's the secret plan you hope you never have to use, but it's one no business can afford to go without. This morning, from the scandal at Penn State to the issues at FSCJ, what is the role of crisis communication when bad publicity hits? One local PR pro has written the book on it. This morning, he'll have some tips and take your calls. But first this morning, whether it's a natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina or a man-made catastrophe like that BP oil spill, it's a guarantee that sooner or later, institutions and businesses will find themselves in a crisis situation. And according to the U.S. Department of Commerce, nearly half of the nation's companies will not survive a crisis when it hits. Why? Well, according to one local PR professional, it's because they don't have a crisis management plan already in place. This morning, from the scandal at Penn State to the ongoing problems at FSCJ and more, Jason Mudd, owner of Axia Public Relations in Jacksonville, discusses the biggest winners and losers in crisis situations as he unveils the tips in his new ebook, Managing Public Relations in a Crisis. Jason Mudd, good morning.
Good morning, Melissa. Pleasure to be here.
Good to have you on the show. This is very timely information for all sorts of reasons. And our question to callers this morning, has your business ever faced a PR nightmare, a crisis? What did you do? And what do you think of the way major institutions are handling their bad publicity, whether it's Penn State, FSCJ, even Barack Obama and Mitt Romney? Let us know your thoughts. 549-2937. That's 549-2937. Send your emails to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. Tweets to @MelissaInJackson. This ebook is available now. Managing Public Relations in a Crisis. I was struck by that data point right off the top that I mentioned. According to the federal government, the Department of Commerce, nearly half the nation's businesses don't have this type of plan. And if something bad happens, they will almost certainly go out of business. Correct?
Well, our numbers show 40%, Melissa, and that's a pretty good number. And when I'm consulting with clients, we often talk about a crisis, not if it happens, but when it happens and how you really need to be prepared for that. So it can happen at any company. Many companies don't expect the exact crisis that occurred to them to be the one that occurred. But having some good pre-planning and even rehearsal period and then revisiting that plan on an ongoing basis is very important.
Having the plan in place is so important. The case study you mentioned in your ebook of what to do right is the famous one in the PR world, Tylenol.
Yes.
Johnson & Johnson. When there was that Tylenol scare back in the 80s and several people died, someone had laced the pills with cyanide, I believe. Mm-hmm. Tylenol did everything right, didn't they?
They did. And the important thing about any time you have a crisis is to, be proactive. There are seasons and there are situations where you kind of let it ride out the storm, as I say in the book. But oftentimes you need to be out in front of it. You need to be very transparent, candid, always tell the truth. And more importantly, if you don't have the information, let people know, I don't have the information today, but here's what we're doing to get it and when we expect to have it by.
And some of the particulars that they did to be proactive, as you said, they recalled all of their product immediately off every store shelf in the country. They took that hit.
Absolutely.
Then they came out with tamper-resistant packaging as a way to try to turn the situation around, and everyone else in the industry followed them. That was quite smart.
It was very smart. The first thing they did, as you mentioned, was get the product off the shelf, and that hedges any future liability, shows good faith to their customers and consumers in the marketplace. And then from that, bad situation, good things came from it, and so now consumers are now safer in the marketplace. Tylenol is viewed as a leader and an advocate for safety, and really set the standard in the industry. We might not like those protective cases today, but they serve a purpose, and they're there to protect the consumers.
So that's the case study of what a company should do. Let's talk about some situations where institutions have really handled a crisis badly. I want to ask you your thoughts, first off, about Penn State, the worst scandal to hit college sports ever in this country. It's just amazing the chain of failures all through their system of top leadership. When you look at the way this was handled, and now Jerry Sandusky, the man convicted of sexually abusing young boys on the campus, now that he's in jail, when you look at the way that was handled, from the interpersonal, the inter-office communications, all the way to the way they put out information to the public, what are some of the mistakes Penn State made?
Well, this is only an hour-long show, so we've got to limit our comments, right? Truthfully, Melissa, it's a heartbreaker. I mean, first of all, just tragic situation. As a father of 2 young children, I never want to have to even imagine this happening. Secondly, the fact that there were people who knew about it and did nothing. Thirdly, what's developing news appears to be a payoff situation and other things happening that are just ugly, ugly, ugly. And what's really been in the back of my mind are, the other victims that we don't know about and the potential of this happening at other programs across the United States and high school level and college level and otherwise. I can only imagine, how tragic that situation is. In their particular case, there was there was ongoing denial and cover up and just so many other things happening.
And in your book, you say the most important thing for a company to do is be transparent.
Absolutely.
And they did the opposite.
They did the very much the opposite. And now they're getting exposed for it. And that's the thing that people need to keep in mind is that the truth will come out eventually. And, recent reports about, Joe Paterno and the level of knowledge that he had that he once denied is now coming out. So it's best to just fess up early and often and get over it.
So that's one institution in Pennsylvania. What about our own local college, FSCJ? They've faced wave after wave in recent months of negative publicity, mainly from an investigative series in the Florida Times-Union. They've retained some very seasoned PR pros to help them through it. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts about the way they're managing their situation?
Well, first of all, FSCJ provides a great service to our community, and of course, their chief executive over there has a great reputation and has done good things. What has happened there has just been a situation where, maybe the oversight wasn't quite what it needed to be, and perhaps the way that has dramatically played out has been, to the detriment of the organization versus, I think, getting in front of it early, addressing the issues, speaking with constituents, and finding resolve. I think they're making the right steps. It may have taken a little longer than it should have. And, I have no doubt that the institution will continue well. And, I think part of them is probably thinking, at least we're not dealing with, child abuse or child sexual abuse here.
But you said getting out in front of bad news early is so important. Time is of the essence because if you don't define your response, the media will do it for you.
Well, the public will through the media. That's exactly right, and something that is very important. And so, I'm always advising clients to think of the worst case scenario and let's work from there. And, it's very...
Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Begin with the end in mind.
Yes, that's right. Absolutely.
And your plan does that.
Very much so. I mean, it's very important for companies to really think of the end result. And, there are possibilities for companies to come out of a crisis more favorably positioned than they were in the beginning. It's hard to do. It has to be done well. But, you never want to lose public trust. And that's why that statistic is so important of 40% of businesses never recover from a crisis, whether it's a weather disaster or an impropriety. And, our research also shows for every $1 you spend as an organization in advance of a crisis, you'll save us $7 when you're in a crisis.
But a lot of top leaders at companies might say to themselves, that's not in my budget. We don't need that. Right?
You better believe it. And, there's not a really good business going around soliciting companies to say, hey, I'm the crisis person and we should work together to prevent a crisis at your company. There's some thought process of if we don't talk about it, it won't happen. But it's a matter of when, not if, when you're dealing with a crisis, as so many examples are being shown every day.
And we're talking crisis communication here with Axia PR's Jason Mudd this morning. If you're just joining the program, whether it's BP, Penn State, FSCJ, or any other institution that's taking hits in the media, what are your questions about how your company should handle a crisis? Let's go to the phones. 549-2937. Philip on the west side. Hi, Philip. Good morning.
Yes, my question is, why are oil companies allowed to raise prices with the speculation of a crisis, and we as gas purchasers not being reimbursed when there really is not a crisis.
Okay, Philip, thanks for the call. And he's talking about BP, of course. Let's talk a little bit about that crisis, how they handled it, and what he's talking about today.
Sure. Melissa, I actually didn't hear the caller very well, but I think what he said is...
Yeah, put your headphones on, sorry. Basically what he said is oil companies can drive up prices. They can use publicity from a crisis situation to drive up prices and blame it on speculation in the oil market, I think was the gist of what he said.
Sure. That's probably a better question for an economist, but from a PR perspective and crisis management perspective, in our current marketplace, it's all about supply and demand, and we have a dependence on oil, and, there's only so many suppliers. And, companies like BP, who clearly experienced a crisis, are a global power, and we're dependent upon BP, whether we like it or not. Their crisis post, fixing the issue has been, pretty well managed. They've got a very nice advertising campaign and community relations campaign to support that. And I've never once felt like BP will suffer long term, from it.
They turned it around.
Well, not only did they turn it around, but I just think it's such a strong company that it would be really hard for people to for the rest of their life to stop soliciting BP stations.
But if you're not a BP, if you're a smaller company, you can go down pretty quickly.
Absolutely. Well, and we all depend on oil and gas to get around and to survive. So there are other companies that are maybe, less of a requirement, more of a disposable income type purchase choice. And, if you don't handle yourself well, people will boycott you and your business.
And it's 549-2937 to join the conversation this morning on First Coast Connect. What are your questions about companies in crisis? Joe in Jacksonville. Hi, Joe. Good morning. Joe, give us a call back. 549-2937. Lots of tweets coming in. Here's one from a listener. Too often, crisis PR begins with denial, which can be disastrous in the long term. You mentioned that about Penn State. What other instances come to mind where a company really just dug itself into a terrible hole because they were just in denial about how bad the situation was?
Well, we've worked with a company who was dealing with a crisis of reputation, and eventually they just continued to blow it off, but they began to see a decline in customer base, a decline in being able to recruit good employees. And eventually someone quantified it and determined that they were losing about $20,000 a day in business over this crisis. So it didn't take long for the phone to ring and them to call on us and say, we've got this issue. Not everybody knows about it, but the people who do are not reacting well, and it's costing us money. So we were able to put together a plan for them and, in a matter of months, turn that around, and the company started growing again.
Now, the plan, this is an ebook, by the way, at Axia.net. Now, it's interesting as you look through it, some of the advice you give to how top executives should put their plan in place and how executives, what they should say in a crisis to the press and to their internal audiences, their staff and shareholders, and what they shouldn't say.
Yes.
And so as I go through this, here's what you write. 6 things you should never say. No comment is number 1.
Well, Melissa, you know that as well as anyone else. There's nothing worse than sticking your head in the sand because you show what? You show your rear. And no one wants to do that. So by saying no comment, you're basically saying I don't want to participate or I have no obligation. Instead, you should make a comment saying, I can't speak to that right now. Here's why, but here's when I will be comfortable speaking about it.
Right. Also, it's never good to blame the media or blame the victims or to lie, which companies tend to do that sometimes. In essence, you're saying the top spokespeople at a company have to be predetermined, and everyone needs to have the plan in place for how to respond in the advent of bad publicity. But I think what's so hard for institutions is when a bad publicity storm hits, it always seems to be something unexpected. And so even if you have a plan in place, it might be the situation you're dealing with might be not anything like what you thought you'd have to address, right?
Absolutely. First of all, Melissa, to your earlier point, the Axia crisis team, we actually have a packed suitcase in our vehicle at all times because you never know when there might be a crisis that you have to get on a plane on behalf of a client. And we recommend the same thing to our clients and to their crisis response team. So
you're like FEMA,
yeah.
but in the PR world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, when business is on the line, it can become very intense. And the other thing I would add is that, you do never know when a crisis is going to happen. You can do rehearsals and plan for things, but, we've seen some pretty crazy stuff at our office.
549-2937. What are your questions about how companies should handle a crisis? Bad publicity. Austin in Mandarin. Austin, good morning.
Good morning, Melissa. Thanks for having me on. I wanted to ask your guest, in the light of the Citizens United ruling and corporate influence on pretty much everything in our lives, isn't this just so much corporate spin that we're promoting here? I mean, corporations are generally psychopathic entities. I mean, if human beings did the things that corporations do, they'd get locked up. So why should there be any kind of group that promotes the defense of this, or why should we even care about crisis management for corporations?
Austin, thanks for the call. And that shows you the challenge because many members of the public are already predisposed to have a negative view of major of the corporate sector in this country.
Absolutely, Melissa. I mean, I sympathize with your listener and his comments. I think it's important to realize that corporations are made up of people. And not
to paraphrase Mitt Romney.
That's right. That's right. But ultimately, I mean, there are hardworking Americans and entrepreneurs who make this country great. And, one person or a group of people can cause things like Tylenol. Oversights like the BP oil spill can happen. And, humans are going to make mistakes. We're not a perfect species in any way. And, without corporations, we wouldn't have jobs. We wouldn't have trade. We wouldn't be able to put food on the table. So, it's easy to blame a corporation and make big corporations look like the bad guy. But the truth is we depend on them directly or indirectly for our quality of life that we have in America. And honestly, people will make mistakes. If we have a client that's done something wrong and they're not willing to address it, then their PR program will never be successful. And so we have to work with them on that. And most people, they realize eventually, hey, I've made a mistake and I need to make it right. Usually there's perhaps an attempt to cover it up or to wish it away, but that doesn't always happen, and you've got to address it right.
And the American public is very forgiving, it seems. If they see good faith coming from someone who messed up, by and large, they tend to go with that.
I couldn't agree with you more. That's exactly right. And that's why, I knew, for example, during the BP crisis that, eventually this will pass. And, as I mentioned earlier in the book, we call it riding out the storm. And sometimes you just have to move on and know that that's a part of your history, and you don't necessarily embrace it, but you have to move on.
549-2937. Nancy in Orange Park. Hi, Nancy. Good morning.
Hi. When you mentioned the Tylenol at the beginning of the show, I thought that was well handled by Tylenol at that time. But in the early 90s or so, they did not have a test for hepatitis C yet. And now I don't know if it's true that the American Blood Bank knew that the blood supply was tainted and did not alert the public because they did not have a cure for it yet. But Tylenol, acetaminophen, which is Tylenol, and alcohol has been proved to be a toxin. And people started coming down with different forms of liver failure, people wandering around confused, some cases of death, and I don't know if you can blame it on the Tylenol company per se, or if it was just the combination of Tylenol and alcohol is a toxin. And it's more dangerous to people that have a liver problem and are not aware of it.
Okay.
So,
Nancy, thanks for the call. Thanks, Nancy. Jason, what about that?
Well, you can believe that in this day and age, a lot of these large corporations have very good crisis plans in place. You'd be surprised, some that don't, but there are many that are. And so, Tylenol and many other companies, based on experience and seeing not only their own companies handle these, but other companies, they have contingency plans, and they are proactively looking for issues and identifying issues that they need to manage well in advance.
Here's a tweet from a listener. What does Jason Mudd think about Mayo Clinic's handling of their recent scandal? It seems to me that was handled well. And I believe they're talking about an issue with medicine falling into the wrong hands over at Jacksonville's Mayo Clinic.
Yeah, that may have had something to do with hepatitis as well. I don't recall.
Yeah,
the
I believe it did.
But
that speaks to how well they handled it.
Mm-hmm. They did handle it very well, Melissa. In fact, a lot of kudos were given to them for exactly how it was managed, and they were very proactive and staying in front of the issue on a regular basis and updating people. And again, that was one person, an internal individual who caused that crisis. It wasn't, the CEO or any kind of corporate greed in mind. It does kind of remind me of the around the same time in the polar opposite with Tiger Woods when he had his marital situation and his domestic situation.
You had denial, lying, everything you advise clients not to do.
And not only that, Melissa, but if you may recall, Tiger kept coming out and making statements, and then
a little more would come out,
yeah.
And then a little more would come out, sort of like John Edwards too.
And he would disappear from the spotlight and refuse to be interviewed, and then he would come forward again to make a new statement, and he just kept pouring his own fuel onto that fire.
Right.
And that's a mistake that companies should never make.
Charles in Jacksonville. Charles, go ahead.
Yes, I've heard your guest use the term mistake often, and it seems to me in a lot of these cases it's not a mistake as much as intentional cutting of corners in the name of profit. And I just wanted his comments on that, and I'll take it off the line.
Thanks, Charles.
So we had an interesting discussion about that on Facebook recently, and that's a good point that your caller makes. I would say that, again, corporations are made of individuals, and individuals might feel pressure or, selfish ambition to, make some decisions. And so greed is a big issue in our country in general, and not just in crisis, but just in corporate philanthropy and how corporate cultures operate. Again, we like to think we represent clients who have, maybe had an issue happen. Perhaps it wasn't their fault, but they want to rectify it in some way. And, and you can't, when you're dealing with thousands of employees and millions of customers, it's hard to make every transaction perfect and just right. And, what a lot of companies are dealing with today are, these websites where they can post complaints and reviews. There are a dime a dozen now, these websites. So as I tell people, if you have millions of customers and 1% of those customers walk away unhappy, you're pretty darn good at what you do. But if those 1% of 1% post something online, the negative about your company, that can really harm your reputation.
Michael in Jacksonville Beach. Hi, Michael. Good morning.
Good morning. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the situation that's happening in London with the Olympic security and G4S, and the chief executive certainly took his medicine yesterday with the Parliament, but obviously that's the right approach as you've been talking this morning, but what's next for them now that they've kind of gotten their lashing from everybody in the press and the Parliament?
Right.
How do they
They're having,
positive?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, they're having the government officials in London and the Olympic Committee, all sorts of issues with traffic and security in London's urban core as they, lock the city down for the Olympics. It's a time when a city wants to shine on the world stage, and instead, Jason, they're dealing with all this negative publicity. Mm-hmm. Not good.
Well, Melissa, that makes me think of the old saying, no good deed goes unpunished, right? Uh-huh. So, of course, London looked at this as an opportunity, and of course there's going to be challenges. There's going to be people that get arrested. There's going to be, in the Olympics in the past years we've seen scandals. I mean, those things happen, and so you have to be prepared for them. Hopefully they did some crisis planning. I'm sure they're getting good counsel, and they'll be working through those issues. But ultimately, that's what every companies look at, successful or otherwise. You need a contingency plan. You need to be prepared to respond and respond appropriately and, with some rationale, not with emotion. And
here's a question for you coming from a listener on Twitter. Why not just use advertising to overcome a crisis? How is PR better?
I love that question. That's a good one. So BP is using advertising today to support their post-crisis situation. Truthfully, advertising is great when it supports content, but viewers and listeners tune into content to get their news and get their information. And so I recommend to my clients they become part of the conversation and they engage in interviews like this to tell their story and allow for people to call in and address the issues individually. And then they can use their marketing dollars to, as I like to say, PR builds a brand and advertising supports it. So use PR to build your crisis case and your positive reputation and your turnaround. Then use advertising as BP has to support it afterwards.
Well, fascinating to speak with you. It's certainly a timely topic. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Melissa. Thank you.
Jason Mudd is the owner of Axia Public Relations in Jacksonville. His new ebook is available online at the Axia.net website. It's Managing Public Relations in a Crisis.